You are listening to the Hiking Radio Network, where we talk the walk with shows by hikers, about hikers, for everybody.
Mighty Blue on the Appalachian Trail, the ultimate midlife crisis. Join Steve and his guests every week as he staggers from Georgia to Maine.
Hi, everybody, and thanks for coming back to the show. For those of you who've just stumbled across this, you are listening to Mighty Blue on the Appalachian Trail, the ultimate midlife crisis. And I'm Mighty Blue, or Steve Adams. I've completed a couple of thru hikes of the Appalachian Trail in my 60s, and now I try to relive past glories with a bunch of friends, new and old, on the show. This week we have a woman who was on the show only a couple of weeks ago. Her name is Chloe Decamera, and we last heard from her about the principles of leave no trace. She now has her own AT journey to talk about, and Chloe will be along soon. Also this week, we're starting our Woman of a Certain Age segment, where we follow Kate Stillwell as she makes her way along the AT. Kate's doing a kind of flip-flop, so she'll be starting from Harper's Ferry and heading south to Georgia, before heading up to Maine and heading south again to finish in Harper's. She'll be starting on April the 1st, so I wanted to catch up with her a few times as she's preparing to get out there. Kate will be along after Chloe. Finally, of course, I'm reading another book. This week, we've got the second chapter from Ben Montgomery's popular book, Grandma Gatewood's Walk. By the way, make sure you come back next week, as my main guest is going to be Paul Stutzman, the writer of Hiking Through, the book that I've just finished on the show and the one that's proven to be the most popular one I've read so far. So now it's Chloe, or as you're about to hear, it's Vulture. We met Chloe Decamera a couple of weeks back when she gave us a bunch of pointers on the leave no trace principles. But as I said at the time, I knew that Chloe had her own story to share from her thru hike in 2015. So I invited her back to share it with you all. So hi, Chloe, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me back, Steve.
I'm glad you're here. And I know that you and I shared one thing when we both hit the top of Springer Mountain at the start of our respective hikes. Do you know what that was?
You're going to have to refresh my memory.
It's in the hairstyle department.
Oh, yeah. We both shaved our heads.
We did. Now, I shaved mine. I don't know about you, and I think I've told people this, but so I'll ask what your reason is in a minute. But I shaved mine because I really felt the need for a different identity when I was on the trail. And I didn't want to be, not so much I didn't want to be Steve anymore, but I wanted to become Mighty Blue. Mm-hmm. So what was it for you? Why did you do that?
Well, that was actually the second time I'd shaved my head. I had done it the year prior in 2014 because, to be quite honest, I just had a really funky haircut and it kept getting more and more funky. And eventually it was just like I had this weird poof of hair on one side of my head. And I said, okay, I can either shave it all off now or have it be a really awkward growing out process. So I asked my friend to shave it, thinking that I would look like Natalie Portman from Vendetta, or V for Vendetta.
Nobody looks like Natalie Portman.
Exactly. I mean, and he went right down the middle, and I felt my scalp, and I was like, oh no, you didn't use a guard. And he was like, well, what do you mean? And so I just said, shave it all off. And so that was probably about 8 months prior to my thru hike. And by the time March rolled around for my thru hike, I was like, well, it's probably like an inch or two long at this point. I might as well just shave it down again. Because I didn't want to deal with a mess of thick curly hair, especially with ticks. That was probably my biggest concern out there. So that was why I shaved.
I actually think it's a great idea. And I actually feel that it's a very liberating experience as well to have just, when you go in the shower, just rub your head a couple of times and you're good to go, aren't you?
Yeah, very liberating.
Yeah, I bet it was. Now, and I believe your hairstyle, or in fact your lack of it, actually played into your somewhat unappealing trail name of Vulture, didn't it?
No, I think it just depends on who you ask, if you're asking if it's appealing or not. If you're asking my mother, the first time I told her, she was like, oh, no, honey, can't we come up with something a little more like soft? But yeah, it did play into my name because the first night of my hike, I stood out on this rock outcrop with my buddy that came out with me for a couple days. And there was this vulture that was just sunbathing on this branch with the Blue Ridge Mountains all behind him. And I'm like, this can't be real. This is beautiful. And apparently I emulated the sound the next day. And my friend said, your trail name should be Vulture. And then like the haircut just added to it. And I was like, well, I guess I do look like a turkey vulture in some senses.
So you embraced it. Good for you.
Oh yeah, I loved it.
Just so people know, they can turn down their trail name. They don't have to tell everybody they meet, because you meet so many different people, don't you? So you can pick it or not.
Yeah, but honestly, like I fell in love with that name and that new identity after a bit because I never met another vulture, and I haven't to this day.
Yes.
I felt a little.
There's a reason for that, by the way.
Yeah. Well, it felt a little masculine at the end, and I liked that when I would sign logbooks as a young woman hiking by myself. Like no one ever imagined me to be Vulture, and I love the reaction of people too. I just thought that was hilarious. And then some friends started calling me Vulch towards the end, and I find that weirdly endearing as well.
Weirdly endearing indeed, yeah. Now, we touched on this a little bit in our previous chat when you talked about the Leave No Trace stuff, but and you said you'd majored in religious studies and that your thesis was something like hiking the AT as a religious experience. How did you even come to the thought process that perhaps it is a religious experience, or at least could be equated with one, if you knew nothing about the trail at the time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for growing up in Western North Carolina, 45 minutes away from Damascus, Virginia, I had very little exposure to the AT. And so when I went to college, my religious studies major was very much the academic study of religion. It wasn't theology, where you're studying something with the belief that it is true. So we had just focused on transformative experiences and people going through some point of their life and they come out a different person or a changed person. And the experience that they have during that transition is really hard to articulate. So I remember just sitting in the office with my thesis advisor and trying to like brainstorm some ideas because I knew I wanted to talk about transformative experiences, but I just didn't know what topic yet. And I threw out a couple options. He was like, no, those are overdone. Like, please don't write another thing about Burning Man. And then I looked down at my paper and I just saw that I wrote down AT thru-hike, because I think at this point in time, I maybe have met one or two people that have thru-hiked the Appalachian Trail. And as soon as I said that, he said, oh, yes, no one's really written on that. You should write that. And so I started researching it, and then I started reading books like Jennifer Pharr Davis's Becoming Odessa, and I ended up interviewing her, and she introduced me to a whole slew of people. So that's how I came to find the topic. And then it just kind of proved my point that every single time I talked to a thru hiker, I would ask, tell me about your experience. And they said, I can't. It's too big for words.
Didn't you find that, and at that stage you hadn't thru-hiked yourself, so didn't you find it fascinating that nobody can really articulate it to somebody who's never done it?
Yeah, it's really hard.
And you feel the same now, don't you? It's you know, I mean, you can share your enthusiasm with people really who've done it. It's very difficult to make that transition to somebody who hasn't done it, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think you've talked about it before where, you know, people are willing to listen to you for up to 3 weeks after your hike, and then they just don't care anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They want you to shut up and move on.
Yeah. So I think at this point, I really don't talk about my personal thru hike often because that's not what my line of work is. But I do still have these undeniable connections with people from my thru hike where we don't even have to say something. We just understand the experience, and that inevitably makes us closer than I can relate to certain other people.
Yeah. So what was the conclusion? And forgive me if there isn't a conclusion to a thesis because I've never written one. So what was the conclusion of what you were citing to make that case? Because you had the idea of doing it. Did you come to the conclusion that speaking to people, that did make the case?
So my bigger argument was that through hiking the Appalachian Trail can be seen as a lived nature religion. And I had based it off of this scholarly article that was peer reviewed that a man had written about fly fishing. And he was saying that it was a lived religion, meaning that maybe the people that are doing the act don't look at themselves and say, yes, this is a religious experience. This is my church. But the language that they use, the actions that they do, the commitment to the sport has a lot of similarities with established religion. So go to mass every Sunday, pray 5 times a day towards a specific direction, etc. And my conclusion at the end of my thesis was that, well, the culture of thru hiking, the act of thru hiking, is really similar to devotions in other religions. And while these people don't say, yes, hiking the AT is my religious experience, the language that they use is extremely religious. And there tends to be this reciprocal relationship of I'm putting in time, effort, blood, sweat, and tears into this trail, but the trail is giving back this inexplicable experience.
Amazing.
They adopt a new identity, a new name, and there's just this undeniable similarity between hiking the AT and devotion within established religions.
I absolutely saw it myself as well. So I agree. And I was wondering, actually, it's a somewhat obvious question. I'm going to get onto your hike in a second, but I'm interested by this thesis you did before you actually did the trail. So the obvious question is, would you have written the same or a similar thesis after you'd finished the trail?
I think I would have written a better thesis after I finished the trail. I remember specifically turning it in, and my professor was like, God, I wish we would have gotten one more rough draft out of the way. But overall, this is great. And my enthusiasm for the topic helps me score really well in my thesis. But I think I would have taken a bigger pool. That would have been the biggest change, a bigger pool of interviewees. So not have just interviewed the people that lived in or around Asheville, North Carolina, but actually gone out and spent months on it and
Sure.
maybe just dedicated that to research so I could have a bigger pool of people to defend my thesis.
But you met that bigger pool anyway, didn't you, on the trail?
Yeah, I did, but I wasn't in the mindset of research at that point in time. So I was in it. I was in that transformative experience at that point where I wasn't trying to prove any point. I was just trying to live this experience.
I'm sure. So you'd established a connection to the trail and it kind of stuck in your mind. When did you decide to seriously make a thru-hike attempt? Because your thesis was 2013 and you started 2015. So what was the time? How did that work out?
It was probably honestly, when I interviewed Jennifer Pharr Davis for my thesis. She lives in the same town that I do. And I had one of my thesis advisors, I ran into her at a coffee shop and she said, hey, I'm reading this book, Becoming Odessa, for a freshman orientation class. You should read it too for your thesis. And so I did. And then I went to the local bookshop and I picked up her another book and they're like, oh yeah, she's a local here. Like, do you want us to leave your email for her? Knowing I had probably told them about my thesis. And I said, okay, yeah, sure. She'll never contact me. And I mean, Jen is just an incredible and authentic and genuine person. So she emailed me so quickly and she said, hey, I hear you're writing a thesis on religions and the Appalachian Trail, two of my favorite topics. Let me know if you have any questions. And so I took full advantage of that. And I asked her to go on a walk and talk and I interviewed her. And,
oh, really? Nice.
Yeah, her daughter was still in a wrap on her chest at this point. So it was it's 7 years ago at this point. It was just great. And I got to hear her story. And eventually we wrapped up the interview and we were walking all around one of my favorite neighborhoods. And we were just standing at a stoplight. I remember waiting to cross. And I said, very off the cusp of like, wow, you make me even want to thru-hike one day. And at this point, I have like very, very minimal backpacking experience. I think I went on a trip when I was 18 and I hated it so much that I pretended to roll my ankle. So before I could even finish that statement, though, Jen just says, you should. And I think she didn't really think much of it, but that was the first time anyone ever told me without hesitation that I was capable of something this incredible and this big of a dream. So I think that's what planted the seed. And by the time I wrapped up my thesis and graduated in December of 2013, I had I remember being at graduation and running into a friend. He was like, what's next? I'm like, I'm hiking the AT in like 15 months. So yeah.
Cool. Did family and friends encourage you or did they try to put you off at that stage?
Oh, that's a great question. My mom laughed. My mom had
Excellent.
the 5 stages.
Can't beat mums, can you?
Yeah. It's like the 5 stages of acceptance. She at first thought it was just a funny joke. And then she said, oh, no, you can't do this. And then so it was denial. And then she saw that I was serious and I was doing research and I was going on big hikes by myself. And then she was like, well, you need to carry a gun. And I said, okay, well, no one in our family owns a gun. Why would I get one now? And so I said, I'm not doing that. And so she is like, okay, you need to take self-defense lessons. And I said, okay, if you pay for them, I'll take them. And unfortunately that didn't end up working out. So she just kind of accepted it begrudgingly by the end of it. And she told me, okay, well, you have to call me every single week when you're out on the trail. And I said, heck no. I am a strong, independent woman. I'm not calling my mother every week.
Every week's not
And
too bad. Come on,
well, and
Chloe.
then to be honest, by the time I got on the trail, I called her every single time I got to town because
Right.
she was the only one that really wanted to hear my story anyways. And I was just so excited. So from a point of absolute denial to her being my biggest cheerleader and actually driving up to Maine to pick me up, she was by far my biggest support system.
Cool. So and my guess, and I don't know you well, we've just spoken on the phone a couple of times, but my guess is you're quite a detailed planner, especially as you said you were planning to put it together for 15 months. So, you're laughing now, so I can tell you are, yeah. So how did you prepare for the journey?
I laugh because I'm looking at my agenda right now with like 15 to-do check boxes. That is my way. It's like a little dopamine every time I tick off
Lovely
to-do list. So
I'm the same, by the way.
Yeah. I started planning 15 months in advance, really because I didn't just want to hike the AT. I wanted to, and see how far I got. I wanted to accomplish it. I wanted to make sure that I saw this goal through. And so I think I took that 15 months saying, okay, that will really give me time to plan and to save up money. So I had a goal of saving up $4,000. And so that was one goal, was just to put away money towards that every month. Yeah. And then, so I started going on more hikes. I forced my friends to take me on backpacking trips that had more experience than I did. And I would go on longer day hikes for like maybe 15 miles and then 16 miles and then 20 and then 21 miles, just to see if I could do it all in one day. And actually, Jen introduced me to Warren Doyle. And I know Warren is a controversial figure. And at the same time, he has been nothing but gracious to me and just really, really spoke to the psychological preparation that you needed to do for a thru hike. And he invited me to come do some really long hikes with him, or he would shuttle me. And so I appreciated that a lot.
Wow. So you had Jennifer Pharr Davis and Warren Doyle in your corner helping you do that hike. That's a really good start, isn't it?
It was. And I think the biggest change I did was I started volunteering for ATC, and that led to seasonal work. And then I moved to the Smokies for 6 months to do seasonal work. And so all of a sudden I had 6,000-foot mountains in my backyard to really help me physically train.
So you're ready, but what was it like when you found yourself at the top of the spring? Were you, even though all that you probably knew in terms of preparation and so on, I don't think anything prepares you for it personally. Mm-hmm. You can be told everything. It's all theory until you actually take that first step. Were you kind of nervous, excited, terrified? I mean, what were your emotions at the time you started?
I really had to pee on the way up to Springer Mountain. I remember that.
Good start.
It was just like, I had my friend driving me up there, and he was driving me in the zebra print Bronco that had like no suspension. So it was so bumpy. And I remember having to pee so badly that I just like couldn't focus on anything. So I was so quiet on the ride up there. And then finally, once I did my business, I was like, okay, yeah, I'm ready. And my mom came out with me to hike up to Springer Mountain with me. And so did my friend actually came with me to hike with me for 5 days. So the three of us are up there. My other friend that drove the Bronco is taking pictures of us. And I'm just like, yeah, this is exciting. Cool. And then we hike down. And when we get to the parking lot, I'm like having hugs. And my mom is hugging me repeatedly. And I'm like, oh, Mom, come on. And then there's one hug where I just realized it all at once. I'm like, oh, this is my last hug with my mom for who knows long. Yeah. And it was that moment where I just felt like a shudder go through my body. And I hugged her, and then my eyes started welling up. I'm like, I have to leave. I have to go right now. And so Mick and I start walking. And as we're walking, I'm like, I need a minute. And so my first few steps on the AT were actually, I was crying a little bit, but it was like good tears. It was just the realization of, oh, this is a decision I've made. And now it's starting.
Now I'm going to follow it through. Yeah. And were you looking for solitude, or did you embrace the social part of the trail when you got, because I know you went with a friend for about 4 or 5 days, but were you looking for the solitude, or, I mean, how was it for you? How did the trail appear to you when you first started?
So I had a lot of knowledge of what it was going to be like out on the trail and the big crowds, especially in Georgia.
Sure.
And I I was really adamant about doing this on my own. And
Right.
I was terrified of groupthink. I didn't want to get sucked into, because that was a lot of what I did in high school. I remember hanging out in the high school, like the Walmart parking lot, and I did not want to be there, but my friends were like, "Oh, well, we'll just figure out what to do." And I just didn't have enough self-confidence at the time to like go off on my own. I would always kind of succumb to groupthink.
Well, there's
And
an
so
irony. Hang on, there's an irony, isn't it? Walmart parking lots are very popular ones you get on the trail, aren't they? Anywhere with a
yeah,
Walmart, you get the cheaper food.
I was a professional loiterer on my thru-hike. I could sit in a parking lot for hours if I needed to, but I just really didn't want to get sucked into like, oh, well, we're all going into town because the weather, and we're just going to hang out here for a couple days, because I was on a budget. I didn't want anyone's else hike to take over my reason for
Sure.
being out there. So I really avoided crowds for Georgia specifically, and then the Smokies, I tried to, but it's really hard to avoid crowds in the
Oh,
Smokies.
yes. Yeah, impossible.
Yeah,
Yeah. So were
and
you camping around the shelters or away from the shelters?
I would actually stealth camp a lot in Georgia, and by stealth, I mean the trail doesn't see me, I don't see the trail. So I wasn't near shelters when I was with Mick. He was my
Right.
friend that came out with me for the first 5 days. So
Yeah,
I had
sure.
a buddy. And then when he left, I started camping at the shelters. But I
Oh,
would hike by
good.
myself for most of the day. And then I would always camp at the shelters or stay inside the shelters in the Smokies. My friend and I, we called each other a shelter rat towards the end, because if we could, then we would stay in a shelter. I have no fear of shelters. Um, yeah,
I
but it
do
wasn't
still.
until
I've done it twice. I still have fear of shelters.
I've slept in shelters hundreds of times. So I did veer away from crowds for the most part of my hike, and I would hike with small numbers, like me and one other person. Me and my friend Rush hiked for a few hundred miles, and then Mouse and she and I hiked for about 1,000 miles together.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
once I got north of Killings in Vermont, I hiked by myself all over again.
So when you were on the trail and you got into the rhythm, because I think we all get into a rhythm of our hike, don't we? Did it make you think about what you'd written about? And because you said you weren't researching anymore, but did you find yourself constantly revising, or in fact, indeed affirming it while you were hiking those miles?
I think that's a good question. I think that I affirmed that it was a reciprocal relationship. It was me and the trail. I was putting in effort to the trail, and the trail was giving me back these incredible experiences.
Interesting.
And I think that by the end, once I was done, it really affirmed my point of, oh, it's just inexplicable. It's hard to put it into words for people that haven't done it before.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people find that all the time. Every time they just get into it, and they just find themselves almost in another world, don't they? They really do.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually you said you partnered up with somebody you hiked with them for about 1,000 miles. And did you find that changed the rhythm of your hike? Because I found it very different to be hiking with somebody as opposed to hiking alone. And I loved hiking with my friend Trigger for 1,700 miles, the last 1,700 miles we did together. But you have to take somebody else into consideration, don't you?
Mm-hmm. So I hiked with a young woman named Mouse, and she and I actually started the same day. I saw her in the Springer Mountain parking lot.
All right.
And I remember talking to Mick and being like, look, another young woman hiking by herself. And I think I scared her because I saw her at a water source later that day. And I was like, you're the other young woman. And she's like, yeah. And I was like, okay, well, I ruined that opportunity. And then we just kind of like leapfrogged all the way through the Smokies. We didn't really talk much. Then when we got to Bland, Virginia, Rush and I, my guy friend at that point, were hiking pretty much together, and Mouse caught up to us in Bland. And then the three of us really just started hiking. Rush kind of tapered off to spend time with his girlfriend. And then Mouse and I really just became this duo. And it really was, we just hiked the same pace, or we'd end up at the same spot every night. I remember a girl saying, well, what's your trail family name? And we looked at her, we're like, oh, no, this is super casual. Like, we're not committed. Like,
we're not in a relationship.
yeah. And we were so defiant because we're like, oh, this is our individual journey. And that was a really, it wasn't hard until we split up in like Connecticut through Vermont. Because we did this like Laffy Taffy split of, I wanted to hike a little more mileage every day to meet up with some friends in Vermont that lived there at the time, and she wanted to slow down, enjoy the days and the journey a little bit more. And so she was trying to hike my hike, even though she was completely physically capable of doing those miles. She just mentally didn't want to do it, and that is completely fine. So it was either like her speeding up or me slowing down, and that's what really brought tension into the hiking relationship. There was never any kind of ill-spoken words about each other, but it just all of a sudden it didn't feel like my hike or her hike anymore. And I remember being in just about to hike Killington, Vermont, and I heard her and Rush, because Rush had caught back up with us at this point, say, "Oh, I'm so glad we're turning around and we're walking like a tenth of a mile south to go to this water hole." And I said, "What do you mean? Like, we have to hike 21 miles today." And they're like, "No, we're going to do that." I'm like, "Okay, well, I think this is it." And I'm hugging them. And one guy was like, "Why are you being so like dramatic? Why are you saying goodbye?" And I'm like, "I think this is it, honestly, because if I were to stay back and not do the miles I need to do today, all of a sudden that hits my mileage to like 25 miles a day, which is extremely hard if you're doing it for 7 days in a row." And so I wanted to just keep on my path and do 21 miles a day. But I knew if I did that and they stayed behind, all of a sudden I'm 5 miles ahead of them, then 10 miles. And it's just so hard to keep up with people at that point. So we said our goodbyes, and I had an emotional hike up Killington because I was like, who am I? What am I out here for? Like, didn't I make like this, like pact with myself to do this as an individual? But in the end, it was so great because Rush and Mouse were really able to enjoy their hike together. And then I was able to like have that sense of freedom and remember my original reasons for being out there as well.
Do you know, though, isn't it like life itself? You know, you buzz along with somebody for a while, and then for some reason priorities change, and then you go different directions and you meet them up again. And I found the AT to be so like life in so many different ways, and just brought home to me what life was really all about. You know, I've written about 50 points of life lessons I learned from the trail. I'm going to turn them into a book one day, I guess, because there are so many examples. And especially listening to my guests, what you just said really articulates what I think about that, how you just buzz along with each other for a while and then suddenly don't. In the case of Trigger and I, we decided we wanted to stay together for the last 1,700 miles, and that worked out fine. But it's definitely different than walking by yourself. There's no question about it.
Yeah, I think if I learned any lesson, it was just if I were to do a hike again, I would not be as tied to people. Like I would allow people to come in and out of my life with more ease and like with less holding on, because I think that would have made the transition a little bit easier to just be like, well, this is life. Sometimes people come in and sometimes they come out, and all of these interactions are so like such a part of your journey, and they're special and they're fleeting.
Yes, absolutely. So you sent me a link to a really great blog post about your Katahdin Day. And can you share a little bit of that with the listeners? Because you're like a crazy woman. You kind of jumped out ready to go. You were talking to day hikers, but pushing yourself up Katahdin. Tell us those emotions and what it was like to get up there.
You know, I think you actually sent me that link to that article, and I had completely forgotten that I wrote it because it's 4 years ago at this point. And so I went back the other day and read it, and it just brought such a smile to my face because the whole article, which is on the trek, it's called My Long-Term Relationship with the AT. And it's really, it's funny to read it 4 years later. And it's depicting my last day of my trail, waking up at Katahdin Springs Campground and hiking up to Baxter Peak. So it talks a little bit about the night before, staying up until like 11 p.m., which is crazy for hikers. Yeah. And but
it's like 4 o'clock in the morning, isn't it? It's like 4 o'clock in the morning in real life.
You were just like excited and giddy, and you couldn't really go to sleep. And I loved what I said about I went to sleep feeling completely content with my life at that point. And that was so true. I mean, it was how often do you go to bed these days and you're like, oh, I got to do that tomorrow. I got to do this. How am I going to get this done? And that was just such the opposite of my last night on the trail of everything's great. Tomorrow's going to be awesome. And I'm just so happy that I've met these friends that I'm with right now. And I did wake up the next morning super excited, and I could not wait for my friends to finish their breakfast. So I just like shot out at 6:30 in the morning to start hiking by myself. And I think I passed a couple day hikers, and I'm like, hey, how are you? Like really bright eyed. And they're like, whoa, lady, it is like 6:30 in the morning. And but it was just, I mean, I felt like a wild animal on that hike. I was just like scrambling up those rocks and throwing myself and hurling myself over these rebar ladders. And it was epic. I bet if I hiked Katahdin at this point in my life, it would be miserable because it would be so hard and not in shape. And
Yeah.
it was, I tried to explain it, but it really was an inexplicable experience of getting up there. I remember that being super cloudy in the tablelands. And then all of a sudden, as I turned to like make the final ascent up to Baxter Peak, all the clouds just spread and split and dissipated. And I thought to myself, like, well, this is what trail magic is. This is like the definition of something I could never replicate if I even tried.
Sure. Sure.
And yeah, just completing that hike, being with my friends up there. And then we ended up hiking down Knife Edge and Pomola, which is the view you have from Baxter Peak. And that is an epic hike in and of itself. And we went down a different trail where our families all met us. And the latter portion of that article that I wrote is, well, how do you cope with finishing a hike after you're done? Like, how do you transition out of that lifestyle that just became the norm for 4.5, 5, 6 months? And I tell people all the time, I got really lucky because I did not end my relationship with the Appalachian Trail, and I still have it. I've never went through the post-trail depression or the blues, and I see a lot of people go through that. And so my argument is, well, how can we have a more reciprocal relationship with the AT? How can we like have this inexplicable experience given to us by this trail, but how can we give back to it? Because no relationship is going to work for the long run if it's just one-sided.
Interesting.
Eventually you're going to lose sight of what that other side needs, I think. And I saw it as a calling for stewardship, to turn my passion for recreating into a form of stewardship. And I started volunteering again with the ATC as soon as I got back. And that led to full-time work. And I've been working with them full-time since 2015.
I think that's the important thing, by the way, the fact that you got straight back into it. You volunteered pretty much straight away, didn't you? And this thing, a lot of us come home, and I did both times, and allowed myself to get a bit down because I didn't take on another big project because I was so bloody exhausted. Mm-hmm. And so the fact, if I think people who get onto something else straight away, it really helps them if they do that. I want to just come back to that post for a second, because it says one of the things you wrote was, if the trail taught me anything, it was how much you could accomplish in one day. And do you feel that the trail gave you the skills to give back to hiking some of what you'd taken from it then? Did it give you the skills to make you want to do this?
Yeah, it gave me the confidence to speak with authority on the AT. It gave me the chance to relate to hikers that I engaged with for 3 seasons as a ridge runner in the Smokies. And I think it just gave me this eye-opening experience of, wow, I could hike 30 miles in a day, or I could get like 50 tasks done if I really wanted to. And also I can balance that with, like, I can give myself self-care. I can take a day off, and I can really replenish myself. And then
0 day. You have a 0 day.
Take a 0 day. Oh my God. So that is something like if you will, like my post-trail depression, I say it didn't happen, but I had a really big moment a couple years ago. So like 3 years into my job, where all of a sudden I wasn't walking towards a goal, and I didn't have something that I was working towards. I had the job, my dream job that I wanted. I had thru-hiked the AT, I had graduated college, I had studied abroad, all of these things that you can kind of tick off a list. And all of a sudden I felt myself wavering of, oh no, what's next? And what if I don't have a what's next?
Yes.
So I think giving myself a little bit of space and empathy to just say, it's okay. You are working towards something, or even if it's not something you're living every single day, you can give yourself a 0 day mentally. And I think it just gave me a little more empathy for myself, the whole trail.
I got empathy from the trail as well, funny enough. That's one of the things was certainly within me. And on the ATC, they some time ago, I think it was a couple of years ago, they rolled out the project, the Wild East, didn't they? Mm-hmm. So can you share something about the Wild East? I'm not sure everybody really knows fully about it.
Yeah, so Wild East is an initiative by the Appalachian Trail Conservancy to expand the definition of what the Appalachian National Scenic Trail is.
Sure.
So we think of it as thru-hikers as this long path from Georgia to Maine, and it's a path to be hiked in one season, or maybe you do it in sections. It's a continuous footpath. And Wild East is giving a bigger picture to everyone of, well, it's not just a footpath, it's also a protected corridor. So the Appalachian National Scenic Trail is a unit of the National Park Service. And with that comes protection. Maybe it's a few feet on each side of the trail. Maybe it's a mile on each side of the trail.
Is it ever as much as a mile? I didn't know that.
It could be, yeah. So
Wow.
it depends on what section of the trail. But you have not only a recreational footpath, but you have protected natural resources on one side. You have a migratory path for birds or for wild animals, large mammals. You have protected streams. You have conservation that's actually making the East Coast still a wild place. Because when we think of, for example, the Wild West, you think of these giant expansive parks with these huge views of mountains and just untouched wilderness for miles. And when you think of the East Coast, you think of the most heavily populated area, urbanization, and major metropolitan cities almost in every single state. So the Appalachian Trail is still that really special protected corridor along the East Coast. And so we do have a Wild East experience here.
Well, my biggest shock was going to New Jersey, because New Jersey in my mind was Newark. That's the only place I'd been to. And Newark, New Jersey, trust me, it's not a great looking place, but New Jersey Appalachian Trail is beautiful at the top of the ridges there. I just absolutely loved it. It was just a shock to me to see how beautiful it could be. So I think the Wild East, looking at it from the perspective of the ATC and how the AT should be looked at, the fact that it's more than just that thin strip of land, I think it's a wonderful testimony to what the East Coast is like.
And the Appalachian Trail is the backbone of that protected trail.
Absolutely, yeah.
Where we can really engage people, but we're also able to engage more people with a broader story, not just because maybe everyone doesn't want to hike, but some people might really be into wildlife ecology and the preservation and conservation of water sources. So it's a bigger story than just the trail.
Sure. Okay. Well, you've taught me something, which is great, which I need teaching all the time. One last question. Do you still harbor any other long distance hiking ambitions, or were you a one and done?
I'm actually going to hike the Long Trail this fall. So, I work a lot on the AT outdoors, and sometimes my office is a backpacking trip for 3 days working with ridge runners. And it just dawned on me this past year, I went on an overnight backpacking trip in the Smokies, not on the AT, with my boyfriend. And as we were going out there, I was thinking to myself, I don't think I've gone on a backpacking trip for in my personal life for over 2 years. I think I got really, really invested into work, and I would be a ridge runner for a season, and then I wouldn't hike for the next month because I was just so exhausted. And I associated the outdoors with work. And it's like the last thing you want to do sometimes is something that you're paid to do all the time. So I'm finally getting back. I love walking around my neighborhood. I could walk. If I go on a walk, as long as I'm moving, that brings me just as much happiness as a backpacking trip. But I've been noticing more and more on these walks, when I am turning the last block or the corner to get home, I say God, I wish I could just do this for a little longer. I wish this could last for a little longer. And so I've decided to hike the Long Trail, and that's a trail I can still keep my job and do, and take some vacation to do it. I don't really have any big dreams to hike the Pacific Crest Trail or the CDT. I admire those that do. It's just not a great ambition. I want to go to Scotland and hike. I want to go to Norway. I'm going to
Scotland in April to hike.
Oh God! I'm
doing the West Highland Way and Hadrian's Wall path, but on both, with 4 other people I hiked to the AT with in 2019. So it's going to be fun.
Yeah. So I just think, I have different goals and dreams at this point, and hiking is still a big part of it, but it's maybe not to the extent of a long distance through hike.
Well, I'm glad you came back on the show to talk to us about it. The Leave No Trace stuff is still massively important. And I love the fact in that you also said you weren't perfect when you were doing it as well. So when you were doing it on the trail. So I thank you for coming back on, and hopefully when you've done the Long Trail, you have to come tell us about that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Steve.
Lovely. Speak to you soon then. Cheers.
Bye.
I I really enjoyed the conversation I had with Chloe. She's such a thinker about the trail and hiking, and I loved her idea of having a relationship with the AT that involves giving back. She's certainly the personification of that. Each week, recently, I've mentioned the donate button on my Mighty Blue website, and it seems that more and more of you are finding it and donating to our shows. I don't deliberately hide it, by the way. The one week I didn't mention it, nobody donated, so I'll just be pointing it out going forward. If you like what I'm doing and you want it to continue, please consider a donation or even a monthly amount of less than a cup of coffee. Each donation is very welcome indeed. Now, in our new segment for probably the rest of the year, here is a woman of a certain age. Well, today we're back on with Kate Stillwell and her daughter Alexa. The two of them attempted a SOBO in 2017, but Kate had to leave the trail, unfortunately, twice with injury. And Kate is our victim for 2020 as we follow a hike. This time she's going to be by herself. Hi, Kate. How are you?
I am well, Steve. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And I know that you are currently with Alexa. Are you out in Colorado?
We are. We're in Denver. Alexa celebrated her 25th birthday.
Lovely.
And so, yeah, family flew out to be with her and to celebrate that milestone birthday. And of course, today is Leap Day. So
that's right.
We couldn't have a better time to talk to you.
Yeah, how about that? Yeah, Leap Day, 29th of February. Yeah. So can we quickly say hi to her? Hi, Alexa. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm good. Happy birthday, first of all.
Oh, thank you.
I wonder, by the way, that I don't know whether you've seen this, and she's probably got it on her phone, although probably not now as we're on the phone to her. I know that when Kate was sending me some text messages some while back, she showed me a screenshot of her phone, which has the countdown for when she starts at Springer, at Harper's Ferry, rather, in April. And the time she sent it to me originally, it showed she had 126 days, 15 hours, 50 minutes, and 15 seconds to go. What's that looking like today then, Kate?
31 days.
Oh, comes down fast.
Ooh.
Doesn't it come down fast, eh? It really comes down fast.
Yeah, it does. And it's I'm so excited and I'm terrified. It's all this, it's kind of the emotions just ping pong back and forth. It's great.
I'm sure. And I bet you can't wait to get started either. But I just want to have a quick few words with Alexa. Did you finish your thru-hike, Alexa, in 2017?
Yes, I did.
Did you? Congratulations.
Well, thank you. I finished actually on Halloween and dressed up as Tinkerbell because that was my trail name.
Of course. So I understand. And I was re-listening to the conversation Kate and I had on the show some time ago, and she said that you were Tinkerbell flitting from rock to rock. Was that how you actually got the name?
Not exactly. It was more about my personality, but it's fine. We'll go with that one.
Oh, yeah, let's go with that one. Absolutely right. Yeah. So was that the fulfillment of a long-held ambition, or are you a regular thru-hiker, or a regular hiker, in fact?
It was kind of a mix where I really got into hiking in college, and I just got it in my head that I wanted to do it, and then just kind of went for it. So it wasn't super long-held, but it was definitely a dream of mine, and I was very excited to be able to complete it. And
has it sort of stuck with you ever since? Because I mean, I've done it now twice, and there isn't a day that goes by that I don't think about it. Although to be fair, probably because I'm doing 4 podcasts a week, which probably keeps keeps me going. So do you think about it most days?
Yeah, absolutely. There are definitely certain aspects of thru hiking that I think just get ingrained in you as a person. And then it also helps. My roommate here is actually someone I met on my thru hike. Some of my friends are still from my thru hike out in Colorado. So it kind of keeps you in the network. Yes,
that's really nice. And I know you spent obviously some time hiking with your mother in 2017. Now, I know she's there right now, but what sort of hiking partner was she? You can tell me, nobody can hear.
Oh, yeah, is that so? She was enthusiastic and had a lot of perseverance.
Right. So enthusiasm and perseverance, that's not a bad thing to have, actually. And funnily enough, when I was re-listening to what we said before, she felt that was your time to do the trail, and she feels that this is her time. So are you quite confident that this time it's her year?
I am. And I love the approach she's taking. And I think having had some experience out on the trail is extremely helpful. I think a lot of people get out there, have no idea what's going to happen, and going in knowing just how bad it can get is hugely helpful in getting through those really hard times that, well, it could always be worse.
Yes, it's tough to imagine how sometimes, but yes, it could always be worse. But funnily enough,
Yeah.
I found that when I went last year, almost exactly a year ago today, actually it was a couple of days ago, I felt incredibly at home on the trail straight away, and I hope that's how Kate's going to feel as well.
Yeah.
Have you given her any advice? Because obviously you did do the whole thing, and I think the arc of a thru hike is so different to just spending a couple of weeks out there, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, my favorite bit of advice I received early on in my hike is something I share with any hiker who asks, actually. As a southbound thru hiker in particular, you start out in the particularly hard states. And
yes.
I think a lot of Sobos have this idea that, oh, well, it'll be a cakewalk from here. And a northbounder shared with me that if you go through the hike with that mentality, every single day is just going to feel like it's defeating you more and more. Whereas if you just embrace the fact that every single day on the trail, there will be some sort of challenge. It might not be physical or mental or emotional. It's just going to be, there will be a challenge every single day. And if you expect that, then it's just part of your day.
Yeah.
It doesn't hit you like a ton of bricks day after day. It's just something you embrace as part of the trail. And I think that mentality helped me a lot, because I had that expectation. And then some days you don't have that. And then it's like, oh, wow, magical.
Yeah, that was easy.
Exactly.
At my age, I had very few of those. That was easy days, let me tell you. They were all tough. I mean, I found every day was a challenge for me. But I enjoyed the challenge every single day as well. And one last thing I wanted to ask you, do you wish you were going with her, Alexa?
Yes and no. I think most thru hikers love the idea of being able to go thru hike again, because it's the best escape from all of the things.
Yes.
And as you mentioned, it does just start to feel like home. So it would really be going home with my mom, which sounds amazing.
Yeah.
But also I think that it really was my time, and it really is her time now. Like, I'm in a different place and she's in a different place. And I think that that's extremely powerful. And I'm just excited to see her adventure, and hopefully maybe I'll be able to keep up and maybe go visit sometime.
Yeah,
cool.
sort of like what we did when Alexa hiked. I met up with her in a couple of places, Parisburg, at Woods Hole, and then I greeted her at Springer Mountain, which makes me cry right now.
Yeah, it was super special.
Yeah.
I got to actually finish the trail with my mom right there.
That
and
must be
she's the one
great.
who sent me my Tinkerbell outfit, so I could finish in my Tinkerbell costume.
Do you know, I
Very
feel,
important.
Yeah, and in fact, I feel that's a picture we need to have actually put in the show notes if possible, but we'll see how that goes.
Oh my goodness, yes.
So Kate, the last time you were with your daughter. So how do you think you're going to cope with the solitude you're likely to face, at least in that first month or so? Because you're going from Harper's on the 1st of April. There might be a ton of people who've made it to Harper's by the 1st of April, will there?
Exactly. I have really mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, it's a great opportunity for me to just kind of get my legs in the pace that I need to do for me.
Mm-hmm.
And being alone it's a little freaky at night. And also not having, even though if you hike with another person, you generally are not hiking at the same pace. So you meet up at different intervals, and you meet up at the end of the day.
Sure.
And that's when it's really, really wonderful. And I will miss that aspect of it, but it's cool. I'm fine with my own company. I'm not freaked out and fearful in any way. So
Good.
For me, it's part of the process.
I'm absolutely not trying to freak you out, by the way, but spending, it will be very different. And I know you're doing this. Is it called a Sobo circuit? I think you called it Sobo circuit.
Circuit or wrap around.
Right.
Yeah,
and that's
whatever.
That's from Harper's down to Springer. And then you're going to go home for a week or so, then go back to Katahdin, having lost your legs, by the way. You make Katahdin your first day back. Good luck with that, by the way.
Well, thanks.
You're going to go up Katahdin and then finish in Harper's as well. So you leave Pennsylvania to right near the end, don't you? Which is quite a good thing.
Well, yes, kind of. But the best part of Pennsylvania going southbound is that you finish in Pennsylvania with really nice.
That's true.
Trail.
True. Yes, that is true.
Comparatively speaking.
Yeah.
So, and then you wind up back in Maryland and West Virginia, which are the easiest from what I understand. And I live in Annapolis, Maryland. So that's one of the reasons that I decided to, it's only 2 hours away from my house. So starting there made sense. And also I have a time constraint. And so I needed to really start in April, but I decided I wanted to go south, sort of in tribute to Alexa and my original plan, which was always to go southbound. But since I can't wait till June to start, because I don't have till November to finish, I figured a different way. And I think it's also, being a woman of a certain age, it's also a better terrain to get my legs in Virginia.
Yes, I think you're right, actually. And funny enough, I was just thinking where you're going to finish. You're going to finish at the ATC headquarters, I presume, aren't you? Is that where you're starting from?
Start and finish.
Yeah. So your walk, the last 3 or 4 miles, is the towpath, isn't it? The canal path.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how we get over the Potomac because of the train that derailed a few months ago.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
Yeah, that's closed. So starting in Harper's Ferry, I won't have that issue. Right. Finishing in Harper's Ferry, by then they'll either have, who cares,
Exactly.
But by then they'll have either I don't care if you have to hitchhike or doesn't matter. It'll be what it'll be, but at least they'll have something figured out by then. Yeah,
well, everybody knows on my show how much I loved finishing at Katahdin.
I know.
And so when you summited Katahdin on that first day in 2017, did you experience any disappointment that this wasn't going to be your finish, or you're just as excited? And the reason I say that is because we had a lady on our show, Duana Blue, who was on some months ago now, and she sold me on it, how exciting it was to finish at Springer. So, and obviously I'm sure Tinkerbell, finishing in a Tinkerbell outfit on Halloween, I'm sure you thoroughly enjoyed finishing at Springer. So I'm glad you get that feeling, but Katahdin is still an epic finish for people. And it's an epic mountain to climb anyway, isn't it?
I agree that it's an epic mountain to climb, and just climbing the mountain is the experience. So I'm okay with that. And I really, for some reason, it always appealed to me organically to hike from Katahdin to Springer.
Oh,
I don't know why, but Springer is definitely you get there and it's sort of like, okay, boy, this is kind of a sort of a boring finish for sure, but it's really not the finish. It's the journey. So I don't know. In Alexa's case, because she graduated college in May, she really didn't have an option. If she wanted to hike in 2017, she had to go Sobo. But for some reason, it just seemed to appeal to both of us, regardless.
I mean, for me personally, as my mom mentioned, it's really about the journey, not necessarily the destination. So yes, Springer was the end point for me, but I definitely wouldn't have had it any other way for the journey I had. I'm a big fan of not having a lot of people near me. So going southbound was 100% the right decision for me. And it made the entire experience exactly what I wanted it to be, even if I didn't end up finishing at Katahdin.
Right. Yeah, I do understand that now. Because there are so many no-bows. No-bow seems to be the way, but you're absolutely right. It's the journey itself that everybody talks about. The destination is wonderful, but the journey itself is what people talk about. Although I must admit, for the last 500 miles on both my hikes, I was looking for the destination. I was kind of done.
Yeah.
So I needed that destination.
I can totally appreciate that would be the case. That destination is what keeps the motor going.
Oh,
yeah, but how cool do you feel if you start your very first day on Katahdin? I mean,
it was epic. And
I would have given up. I would have given up. I couldn't have done that. My first day, I couldn't walk more than 10 bloody yards without needing oxygen.
I've got news for you. That day in Katahdin in 2017, they had a heat wave. Oh. They had a near record. It was in the high 80s. And here we were in waterproof winter boots. I wound up with blisters because my feet sweat. And it's not like you brought your first aid kit with you. Who the heck thought that it was going to be that hot? Yeah. And it was a gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous day hiking. No clouds anywhere. It was magnificent. And not everyone gets that
You're
that
absolutely right.
opportunity
Yeah.
to see Katahdin that way.
Yeah, you're
And it was
absolutely
June
right.
8th, which
Yeah.
is early in the year. So
Yes.
I
I thought it wasn't. I thought it wasn't open to
epic.
July. I thought for some reason it wasn't open to July. People normally started July, didn't they, when they're going southbound?
No, the mountain that year opened June 1.
All right, must be June 1.
So we were there June 8th.
Nice.
And we stayed at Katahdin Stream Campground the 7th and the 8th. We hiked Katahdin on the 8th and headed south.
And you're going to do it all over
Yeah,
again?
I'm going to do it all. Yes, I am. I
Enjoy.
think, however, I think the only place that I'm thinking completely being successful here, that the only place that I will decide consciously to bypass is where I broke my arm in Vermont.
Oh.
I have no desire to remotely go near that space.
All right. Well, look, this was just to reintroduce you to people before the show starts in earnest in April when you get started. We are going to speak to you every week up to there with your preparations and so on. I wanted to catch up with you and Alexa while you were together. So happy birthday, Alexa. And next week we're going to start talking about your preparations, your gear and your conditioning for the hike. Okay. So good talking with you guys.
Awesome.
And I'll speak with you soon. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Steve.
Cheers then. Bye.
Bye.
It was great to chat with Kate and her daughter, and I'm also pleased to be following a flip-flopper for the first time. Let's hope that she gets a good run at it and is able to emulate her daughter's success of a couple of years ago. Finally today, we have the second chapter of Grandma Gatewood's Walk by Ben Montgomery, where we learn much more about Emma and the tough life that she's had in getting to the trail. I'll see you all next week. Chapter 2. Go Home, Grandma. May the 10th to the 18th, 1955. The Cherokees were gone, most of them relocated at gunpoint to Oklahoma, but their stories still whipped through the passes of the ancient Blue Ridge Mountains of North Georgia. In the beginning, as the native creation story had it, the earth hung from the heavens by 4 cords, and the surface of the earth was covered by water until a beetle dived down and brought up mud, creating land, which spread in every direction. One by one, emissaries visited from the sky realm to see if the earth was inhabitable, until a great vulture made an exploratory trip. When he tired, he flew so low his wings brushed the earth, punching valleys on the downthrust and bringing forth mountains, these mountains, on the updraft. When the land finally dried and plants and animals came, they were given instructions to stay awake for 7 nights to keep watch over their new habitat. Nearly all were awake the first night, but several had fallen asleep by the next, and more by the third, and then others. By the 7th night, only the pine, spruce, laurel, holly, and cedar plants had stayed awake to the end, and they were rewarded medicinal properties and evergreen foliage. The rest were punished and made to lose their hair each winter. Of the animals, only the panther, owl, and a few others remained alert. They received the power to see in the dark, to own the night. Darkness was falling. Emma walked as fast as she could, feeling alone, and the trail carried her over the mountain until she finally found a narrow logging road and hurried down it, keeping in the middle until she came upon some large machinery and a shed about 10:30 p.m. She crept inside, spread a blanket on the floor, and secured the door. She heard dogs barking, then a pickup truck, but she stayed still. In the morning, when she finally woke, she stepped outside. In the soft light of dawn, she could see that she'd found a way into the middle of a summer camp, but it appeared to be vacant. No camp counselors blowing whistles and no children doing morning exercises. Her own children had no idea she was here. She wasn't even sure if all 11 of them knew about the Appalachian Trail or how the footpath had been calling her, how she'd been captivated by the fact that no woman had yet hiked it alone. They knew she loved to walk, that she'd stalked through the hills of Gallia County, awed by the stillness and quiet of the forests. They remembered stomping through the woods with her when they were young, when she'd urged them to listen for bird songs and teach them to watch for snakes around blackberry bushes and point out the medicinal properties of wild plants, as if she were preparing them for their own journeys. Her resolve, hardened by years of white-knuckle work, was intact. She trod along through the ferns and galax, ground cedar and mayapple, through great patches of oak and hickory and poplar trees. The flowers were popping, the bloodroot, trillium, violets, bluets, ladyslipper, and beard tongue. As she approached the edge of the forest, she saw something that beckoned her on, something she wouldn't see again for another 2,000 miles, like a gift from the Cherokee, a pink dogwood. She had told no one of her plans for the long walk that year, for fear they'd worry or try to stop her. She hadn't even told them about the year before, about her failure. That would be her secret too, a pact between her and God and the park rangers in the Maine wilderness who saved her life. She first laid eyes on the trail in a doctor's office back home, inside a discarded National Geographic from August 1949, and the 19-page spread with colour photographs was a window to another place. The photos showed a bear cub clinging to a tree by a trail blaze, shirtless men scrambling up lichen-speckled boulders above the tree line in Maine, teenage hikers atop rocks at Sherburne Pass in Vermont, hikers on an overlook at Grandeur Peak, a girl hiker inching through a crevice near Bear Mountain in New York. She read that a hiker in the Great Smoky Mountains had looked down into a deep canyon and had seen a lank man hoeing a corn patch. The steep cliffs made the hollow seem inaccessible, so the hiker shouted, "How'd you get down there?" "Don't know," came the reply. "I was born here." She read that the soul-cheering, foot-tempting trail was as wide as a Mack truck, that food was easy to come by, and that trail-sized shelters were plentiful and spaced within a day's walk from one another. The Appalachian Trail, popularly the AT, is a public pathway that rates as one of the 7 wonders of the outdoorsman's world, the article gushed. Over it you may hayfoot, strawfoot, from Mount Katahdin with Canada on the horizon to Mount Oglethorpe, which commands the distant lights of Atlanta. The old woman had been captivated. "Planned for the enjoyment of anyone in normal good health," it read. "The AT doesn't demand special skill or training to traverse." By the time the article was published in 1949, just one man, a 29-year-old soldier named Earl V. Schaefer, had officially reported hiking the trail's entire length in a single continuous journey. In the 7 years since Schaefer's celebrated hike, only 5 others had achieved the same. All were men. Emma intended to change that. "I thought that, although I was 66, she would later write in her diary, I would try it." She didn't tell anyone what she planned to do, and she gathered what she thought she could not do without, not what one was supposed to take on a 2,000-mile hike. Those who had come before arrived with mail-order rucksacks and sleeping bags and tents and mess kits. Not Emma. Her little sack weighed 17 pounds. Since it was July 1954, by the time she was ready to set out on a 5-month journey, she decided to start in the north and race the cold south. She caught the 6:15 a.m. Greyhound out of Gallia County for Pittsburgh, and there caught the New York Express to Manhattan, then another bus to Augusta, Maine, arriving early the following morning. She caught another bus from Augusta to Bangor and checked into the Hotel Penobscot for the night and gave the man behind the counter $4.50. The next morning, July the 10th, she caught a cab to Pittman Camp and arrived at 10:30 a.m., then climbed Mount Katahdin, the northern terminus of the trail. 3.5 hours later, she was back down, just before dark. A young couple invited her to share broiled hot dogs and pea beans baked with molasses and salt pork. Then she spread a blanket and drifted off to sleep under a lean-to at Katahdin Stream Campground, where the creek sings all night. The next morning, before the sun peeked into the valley, she left a suitcase with a park ranger, gave him $1 and asked him to send it back to Ohio. Then she set off for York Camp, a sporting cabin on the west branch of the Penobscot River. A few miles in, she realised she had packed too many clothes, so she emptied her bag, stuffed her extras into a box, and asked the folks at York Camp to mail them back to Ohio. She hiked from there to Rainbow Lake, some 13 miles farther, and a nice family at the campgrounds treated the draggled old woman to roast beef and pie. She decided to take the next day off and stayed 2 nights. The next morning she started early. When she came to a weather-rotted sign, she took the wrong trail. She didn't know that the Appalachian Trail was marked with white blazes and wound up walking far off course. Just before noon, she popped out of the forest and into a patch of bracken and realised she had lost her way. She searched for an hour and a half in the wilderness but couldn't find the path. She climbed a knoll in an open space and built a fire and lay on the ground. She whistled and sang a little and nibbled on the raisins and peanuts she brought along. "I did not worry if it was to be the end of me," she wrote in her diary. "It was as good a place as any." After lunch, she went in search of water and disappeared deeper into the wilderness, following game trails through thick summer vegetation. As night fell, she found a rock and lay down to try to rest. When bands of rain blew through, she stood until they passed. She tried more paths the next morning, exerting precious energy on a second wasted day, none leading her to the trail she had taken in, her food supply running short. She uprooted bracken to make a bed under an overturned rowboat she found leaning against some evergreen trees. She lit a fire, filled a coffee can with water, and doused the flames, hoping the smoke signals would alert other hikers or the rangers at Baxter State Park. But no one came. She decided to take a bath in a small pond, and she placed her eyeglasses on a rock. She forgot where she'd put them and took a bad step, crushing a lens. She tried to patch it with a Band-Aid, but she could barely see. She kept the fire going a few more hours until 11 o'clock, but the wood was running short and she was growing tired. She ate the last of her food and lay down to rest, covering her face to keep the black flies away. Then she heard it. An airplane came into view, flying low above the trees, the thump of its propeller echoing off the mountains. She jumped to her feet and waved a white cloth to try to flag the plane, and then it was gone. She lay back down and closed her eyes. She was out of food and almost out of hope, lost in a vast wilderness not even 30 miles from where she had begun. What would she say when she got back home, if she made it back home? What would she tell people? She didn't know it, but the ranger at Rainbow Lake had radioed the next camp 8 miles away, asking for an update when Emma arrived. When she didn't come, the foresters launched a search. Emma looked around for wood sorrel, which could be eaten for nourishment, but couldn't find any. Nor could she find early chokeberries, blueberries or cranberries, which had yet to bloom. She decided to try to find the trail one more time. She collected her things and started back the way she had come. By luck or miracle, she found the path back toward the camp and set off. She hiked for hours and finally arrived at Rainbow Lake by 7 p.m., where she found a group of men throwing horseshoes. 4 Baxter State Park rangers had been frantically searching for her. They'd come across a camp while she was out scouting, and they found traces of a fire. They had combed the woods, calling out for her, but she never heard them. "Welcome to Rainbow Lake," one of the men said. "You've been lost." "Not lost," Emma said, "just misplaced." The rangers, all men, were annoyed. They started telling her she should go home. "I wouldn't want my mother doing this," one of them said. She had broken glasses, no food, and not much money. Maybe they were right. Maybe she should quit. 2 of the rangers helped her into their monoplane and flew her to a nearby lake where the Baxter Park superintendent was waiting. He took her to the railroad station at Millinocket and put her on a train back to Bangor, where she staggered through the streets, people casting sideways glances at her, and into the Penobscot Hotel, the same place she'd stayed 7 long days before. The man behind the counter said the hotel was full. "Have you tried any other place?" he asked. "No," she said. "I stayed here last week." The man scratched around in some papers on the counter. "They won't want that room tonight," he said. "You can have it." A bellboy escorted Emma upstairs. "Don't you remember me?" she asked him. "Yes," he said. "I've been climbing mountains," she said. She closed the door and dropped her bag and walked to the mirror. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Broken glasses. A black fly had bit her near the eye and it was bruised. Her sweater was full of holes. Her hair was a mess. Her feet were swollen. She thought she looked like a drunk out of the gutter. A vagabond. A 66-year-old failure. She'd tell no one about this. This time would be different. She had learned hard lessons. She had been on the trail 8 days when she caught a ride from a man and woman named Jarrett, who were picking up fertilizer near where a truck had spilled its load. They allowed her to stay the night at their home and drove her back to the trail the next morning, to the same spot from which she'd left, and sent her packing with a mess of corn pone. She walked 20 miles that day, finally reaching Hightower Gap as a spring thunderstorm moved in. She made her bed on some boards under a cement picnic table. She rolled back and forth all night, trying helplessly to stay out of the rain. She set off the next morning and, at long last, on May the 14th, she crossed the state line and left Georgia behind. She started up the first mountain in North Carolina, and the sun beat down upon her neck. She was tired. She raked together a bed of leaves and settled in for a nap. When she woke, she felt a little like Rip Van Winkle. That afternoon, as another storm approached, she heard a cowbell clanking in the forest and a man calling hogs in the distance. She thought there might be a place to stay nearby, but when she walked down into the gap, she didn't see a soul, No homes, no hogs. She was walking through a part of the world that was full of secrecy and distrustful of outsiders, the broad and beautiful setting for a never-ending game of cat and mouse between the people of the hills and the government stiffs. In these secluded hills, a man could scrape out only a meagre living through lawful ways. If he wanted to get ahead, he needed more than a few hogs and a rocky plot of corn. The mountains were both a curse and a blessing, though, and the thick woods, tall peaks and skinny valleys provided natural coverage for an assortment of clandestine entrepreneurialism. Chief among them was moonshining. It started with the water, pure and cold, which bubbled up endlessly out of limestone springs. It was aided by the blue haze that hung low and camouflaged the hickory smoke from the fires that cooked the mash. So out flowed secret streams of illegal moonshine, 100-proof white lightning, in the trunks of jalopies destined for the big cities of the Midwest, Detroit, Chicago and Indianapolis. The local lawmen tended to look the other way. Cutting stills was impolitic. The state, however, saw opportunity, specifically the opportunity to tax and tax often, and if it couldn't tax, it could handcuff, and thus raised a battle that occasionally sent bullets whizzing through these hollows. Emma was a teetotaler. She didn't even drink coffee, and she took great pride in that fact, making a point to turn it down outright, a hidden lecture buried in her refusal. But she knew of the battles that had seized the region, and she tried to be careful as she plodded through. She was startled when a man stepped from behind a tree. "Are there any houses around here?" she asked. "Not around here," he said. The man introduced himself as Mr. Parker, and another man walked up to them, Mr. Birch. They told her they had been checking on their hogs, which roamed free in the woods, each wearing a cowbell, and they were camping at a lean-to a few miles away. If she could walk there, she was welcome to stay, they said. They seemed nice enough. She agreed, and Mr. Birch took her pack and carried it toward the shelter. When they arrived, another man, Mr. Enlow, joined them. They gave Emma straw for a bed and let her dry her wet clothes by their fire. In the morning, 2 of the men left after breakfast and said they'd return by dinner, leaving Emma alone with Mr. Birch. She had decided to take the day off to give her aching legs time to recover. They asked her to make cakes out of the stewed potatoes left over from breakfast, so she mixed the potatoes with flour and eggs and fried the loose patties in a skillet over the fire. She'd come to the trail for solidarity with nature, for peace, and here she was, doing chores for a group of men. That afternoon, the forest warden and game warden stumbled upon Emma and Mr. Birch. They thought Emma was Birch's wife. She was embarrassed, but didn't correct them. She didn't want to explain what she was doing out on the trail. She didn't want to talk about why she was walking or what she had walked away from. He'd found her in the dark. She was walking home from church in Crown City, Ohio, on a chilly night. He rode up beside her on his horse, Dick. Her cousin, Carrie Trowbridge, knew him from town and introduced them. P.C. Gatewood was the catch of Gallia County, Ohio. He was slender, with a soft tan complexion and short brown hair. He was a strident Republican, and he came from plutocrats. Regional royalty, or at least they presented themselves in that fashion. His family owned a furniture factory at Gallipolis. At 26, he was 8 years older than Emma, and he seemed worldly, aristocratic even. He had earned a teaching degree from Ohio Northern University, making him one of a handful in the region with a college diploma, and he taught children to read and write at the one-room schoolhouse nearby. He asked if she wanted a ride, and she accepted. He helped her up onto Dick. She had never ridden behind a man before, and as they galloped down the road, she could scarcely stay on the horse. There was no way she was going to put her hands around PC's waist. He carried her home several times that winter, through the barren trees that cast crooked shadows on the hollows, but she never grew bold enough to slide her hands round his body. That wouldn't be proper. One night she fell off, slid right off the back of the animal. PC stopped long enough to give her a hand back on. Winter turned to spring, and PC began making more advances. Emma hadn't spent much time thinking about a future with him, but in March he suddenly grew more serious. Out of the blue, he asked her to marry him. For the life of her, she couldn't understand why he was rushing. He seemed to want to get married right away. She wasn't ready. She bided her time and put him off for 2 months. They'd come from different lives, raised in close proximity but worlds apart. She'd been born in October 1887 in a puny house near Mercerville, a mile from where the creek forked. The house had a barn, a well, and a terrible view of an ugly bluff. but the children played over the hills. There were 12 in all at the time, and their parents shoved them off to the one-room Kofa school when they didn't have chores at home, which was rarely. Her father, Hugh Caldwell, was a Civil War veteran, Union tried and true, whose parents had come from Scotland to farm. He was famous for having raised his head above a stone wall in the heat of battle to see where the enemy was. He was wounded later, then lost his bad leg, and after the war he was considered an old reprobate with an affinity for gambling and a taste for whisky. Her mother, Evelyn Esther Trowbridge, was of British descent, offspring of a clan of Trowbridges who moved to America in the 1620s. She was not far removed from Levi Trowbridge, who fought in Captain Thomas Clark's Derby Company in the Revolutionary War and with the Green Mountain Boys under General Ethan Allen. Emma had lived a dozen lives by 18. She still bore the scars from the day her sister Edda was heating water to wash in a kettle and a spark jumped out of the fire and caught Emma's clothes. Her mother applied medicine with a feather. Emma ate fruit from the blackhaw tree and chased her cousin around the barn. When her family moved to Platform in Lawrence County, near Guyan Creek, her father intended to build a new house. He set the stone but never got around to erecting the rest. They stayed instead in a log cabin, and her father built an extra bedroom on the front porch. The children slept 4 to a bed, and in the winter the snow on the clapboard roof would blow in on them, and they'd shake the covers before it could melt. They peed off the front porch when their parents weren't looking. Her mother birthed 3 more children in that house, making 15 in all, 10 girls and 5 boys. On hot afternoons, they waded into the creek to get their clothes wet before they took to the fields to hoe corn or plant beans, or worm and sucker tobacco, or harvest sugar cane and wheat. They'd work until their clothes were dried and then repeat the cycle. Once, when Emma was instructed to plant pumpkins, she grew tired of the monotonous chore and planted handfuls of seeds in each hill. Each plant came up and her little secret was out. On Sunday mornings they put on their best clothes and walked a mile to Platform to Sunday school, and after church the children would climb into the fingers of young trees and ride them to the ground. They hunted wildflowers and climbed all the cliffs they could find, and on one they held firm to a bush and rappelled down its face to peek into a small cave. Once, Emma's older sisters told her she could catch sparrows at the cattle barn if she threw a little salt on their tails. For hours she worked that Saturday, trying to salt the birds' tails. The children would take a jug of water and set it by a bumblebee nest, then punch the nest. The bees flitted out of the nest and went straight into the jug, and the children plunged their hands into the nest for raw honey. They went to school just 4 months a year due to their farm work, and sometimes that dwindled to 2. A gander stood guard outside Guyan Valley School, and when he saw the kids coming, he'd stretch out his neck and flap his wings and hiss. Occasionally he'd make contact and bring tears. In 1900, when Emma was 13, her father sold the farm and bought another on the Wiseman's side of Raccoon Creek, a mile above Asbury Methodist Church and a mile below the Wagner Post Office. They sent the children to Blessing to school, but all were behind in their grades. They tried hard and finally caught up, but the school only went to 8th grade. When Emma was 17, her father fell at work and broke his good leg. His mother took him to Gallipolis and he was hospitalised for 2 months. Emma stayed home from school and did the work. She milked the cow before breakfast and did the washing on Saturdays. The boys killed hogs and Emma had to make the sausage, lard and head cheese. Her mother was surprised that things were in such good order when she returned. Emma had done all the mending, cooking and cleaning too. In 1906, when she was 18, she left home for 8 weeks to work as a housemaid in Huntington, West Virginia, across the Ohio River. She hated it and came home as soon as she could. That summer, her cousin Carrie Trowbridge asked her to come and stay with Mrs. Pickett, her grandmother, who lived near Sugar Creek. Mrs. Pickett paid Emma 75 cents a week, and she was responsible for the milking, washing on the board, ironing, cleaning, shelling corn for the chickens, bringing in coal for the cooking, and washing dishes. That's when she met PC. There she was, away from home, him asking her to marry, and her keeping him at arm's length. But he'd had enough of this game of hard to get. He threatened to leave, to head west and never come back if she refused to be his wife. She begrudgingly said yes. She quit school and collected some clothes and went to her aunt Alice Pickett's house, where Perry was waiting with her uncle, Asa Trowbridge. On May the 5th, 1907, the two exchanged vows and Emma Caldwell became Mrs. P.C. Gatewood. They celebrated with a large dinner, then rode in a covered buggy up the Ohio River to Gallipolis and out to her mother's place above Northrop, where they spent their honeymoon night in a room fashioned out of bedsheets, before heading up to the little log cabin he owned on a hillside above Sugar Creek. It wasn't long before the honeymoon was over, PC began treating Emma as a possession, demanding she do his work, mopping, building fences, burning tobacco beds, mixing cement. It wasn't what she had in mind, but she tried hard to make the best of it. They were married 3 months before he drew blood. Standing Indian Mountain jutted from the earth nearly a mile, the highest point on the trail south of the Great Smokies. Emma, after a full day of rest and a good night's sleep on a bed of hay in the lean-to, saying farewell to the men and pigs and having a breakfast of leftover potato cakes, pushed forward, canvas ked in front of canvas ked, until she crested the mountain in the mid-morning. The mountain was named by the Cherokee, who told of a great winged creature that made its home here. A bolt of lightning shattered the mountain and killed the creature, but it also struck a warrior who was turned to stone. The mountain was named on account of a peculiar rock formation that used to jut from the bald precipice and looked very much like a man. It took her an hour and a half to ascend, and behind her was a superb view of the Georgia Blue Ridge Mountains, from which she'd come, through Deep Gap and Muskrat Creek and Sassafras Gap and Bly Gap. She needed to doctor her feet, but it was too early to stop, and even without a map she knew the toughest part of the journey so far was just ahead of her. After a long trek through Beach Gap and Betty Creek Gap, she began to climb Mount Albert, scrambling much of the way over steep rocks, and it was indeed the hardest climb yet in the 13 days she'd been hiking. That evening, after 20 miles of walking, she ventured 2 miles off the trail to find a place to stay. She discovered an empty lean-to at White Oak Forest Camp. The night was cold and she tried to build a fire, but her matches were wet and would not strike. She squirmed into a corner of the shelter and shivered under the blanket until she fell asleep. She was greeted by rain the next morning, so rather than set off, she walked to the game warden's house and introduced herself. The warden's name was Waldrop, and he and his wife drove Emma 2 miles back to the trail on their way to town. She started off slow, rain falling all day, and she arrived at Wire Camp at 4 o'clock and built a small fire to dry her clothes. The nearest lean-to had an earthen floor which was cold, so she heated a long board over the fire and rested atop it for warmth. When the board cooled, she did it again. She left 10 minutes after 6 the next morning, greeted by the early birds of the Nantahala, a Cherokee word meaning land of the noonday sun. A vast and dark forest visited by Spanish conquistador Hernando de Soto in the 16th century and the naturalist William Bartram in the 18th. When Bartram came through, he beheld with rapture and astonishment a sublimely awful scene of power and magnificence, a world of mountains piled upon mountains. He continued, "The mighty cloud now expands its sable wings, extending from north to south, and is driven irresistibly on by the tumultuous winds, spreading his livid wings around the gloomy concave, armed with terrors of thunder and fiery shafts of lightning. Now the lofty forests bend low beneath its fury. The limbs and wavy boughs are tossed about and catch hold of each other. The mountains tremble and seem to reel about, and the ancient hills to be shaken to their foundation. The furious storm sweeps along, smoking through the vale and descending from the firmament, and I am deafened by the din of thunder. The tempestuous scene damps my spirits, and my horse sinks under me at the tremendous peals as I hasten for the plains." Here walked a new pioneer, her swollen feet inside worn-out tennis shoes, climbing up wire board and up the steps of a stone fire tower built 20 years before by the Civilian Conservation Corps, spinning now, absorbing the breathtaking views of the surrounding range, the world of mountains piled upon mountains, alone, happy.